The man who rode into Caldwell, Kansas on the last day of August in 1882 looked like someone who had already made peace with dying, and the woman who watched him from the window of the dry goods store looked like someone who had already made peace with being left behind. Stephen Brooks pulled his horse to a stop in front of the water trough on the main street of Caldwell and let the animal drink while he looked up and down the road with the careful eyes of a man who had spent too many years watching shadows. He was 29 years old, lean in the way that hard living makes a man lean, with dark hair that curled at the back of his neck where it had grown past the point of respectability, and a jaw that had not seen a razor in the better part of a week. The dust of the Kansas plains had settled into the creases of his coat, into the band of his hat, into the lines around his eyes. He looked like the land itself had tried to claim him and had not quite finished the job. He had one debt left to pay in this world, and she was the one he owed it to. The dry goods store was called Hale and Sons, which struck Stephen as quietly sad because there were clearly no sons left in it. The sign had been repainted, he could tell, and the second word had been changed from something else, something that had been there longer. He had asked about the store at the last town, and then the one before that, working his way down the trail from Dodge City with the name Maggie Hale tucked against his chest like a letter he was afraid to open. He tied his horse and went inside. The store smelled of dry wood and coffee beans, and the faint sweetness of molasses from a barrel near the door. Shelves ran the length of both walls, stocked with the careful precision of someone who knew the value of things and would not waste an inch of space. Bolts of fabric were stacked at the far end, and above them, coils of rope hung from iron hooks, and below those, tins of tobacco and baking powder and dried beans in labeled sacks stood at attention like small soldiers. The woman behind the counter was weighing out flour for an older man who was telling her something about a fence post, and she was nodding at the precise intervals that suggested she was listening without really hearing him, the way a person does when they have heard the same complaint from the same person so many times that the words have become a kind of wallpaper. Stephen stopped just inside the door and looked at her. Maggie Hale was 26 years old, and she carried herself with the particular dignity of a woman who has had to be her own steadying force for a considerable amount of time. Her hair was the color of dark honey, pulled back at the neck in a practical knot, though a few strands had escaped around her face, and she had not bothered to push them back. She was not conventionally beautiful in the way that meant she stopped conversation when she walked into a room, but there was something about the line of her jaw and the directness of her dark eyes that made Stephen think she was the most interesting face he had seen in a very long time. She finished with the flour, and the old man shuffled out past Stephen, giving him the measuring look that small-town people gave to strangers, and then Maggie looked up. Her eyes went to his face first, then to his coat, then back to his face, and something moved through her expression that was not quite recognition but was the neighbor of it, the way a familiar song sounds when you hear it played in a different key. "Can I help you?" she said, and her voice was even and careful. "I'm looking for Maggie Hale," Stephen said. "You found her." He took his hat off, which was something he only did when he meant to be taken seriously, and he held it in both hands and said, "My name is Stephen Brooks. I rode with your husband for 2 years before he died. I was with him at the end." The store went very quiet. Outside, a wagon rolled past on the street, and the wood of the building creaked in the August heat, and Maggie Hale looked at him with those steady dark eyes and did not flinch, though he could see that the words had landed on her. "Thomas," she said, not as a question. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The store is empty right now. Come around to the back. I'll put coffee on." The back room of the store was part storage and part living space, with a small stove and a table and 2 chairs, and a curtain across the doorway that led to what Stephen assumed was the main living quarters of the building. It was tidy with the efficiency of someone who had less space than they needed and had made peace with that fact. A small window looked out onto the alley behind the store, where a single sunflower had grown up through a crack in the ground, without any help from anyone, bright and absurd and determined. Maggie put the coffee on without asking him how he took it, which meant she was the kind of person who defaulted to practical action when her emotions were giving her trouble. Stephen sat down in one of the chairs and waited. "He wrote to me," she said, her back to him as she worked at the stove. "He wrote until about 6 months before he died. Then the letters stopped. I knew after a while, you know how you know things. He talked about you every day," Stephen said, and it was true, which was the only reason he had any right to say it. Thomas Hale had been a man of few words about most things and many words about his wife, and Stephen had listened to all of them over 2 years of campfires and cattle trails and one disastrous winter in Colorado that neither of them had expected to survive. Maggie turned around and set a cup in front of him, and sat down across the table with her own cup held in both hands, and she looked at him with the directness that he was already starting to understand was simply how she was. "Tell me," she said. "All of it, please. People always try to spare me things and I have never found it helpful." So he told her. He told her about the cattle drive that had gone wrong in the spring of 1881, about the river crossing that had cost them the better part of the herd and 2 good hands, about how Thomas had broken his leg in the confusion, and how the infection had set in 3 weeks later when they were still 100 miles from the nearest town. He told her about the last week, which had been peaceful mostly, as these things went. He told her about the message Thomas had asked him to carry. Maggie listened to all of it without interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "And the message," she said, "Stephen had carried it for 14 months. He had thought about how to say it approximately 900 times. He said, he wanted you to know that the store was his idea but you made it real, and that if you ever find yourself uncertain whether you can keep it going, the answer is yes. He said you could keep anything going." Something moved across Maggie's face then, something that was grief and love and old pain all at once, and she looked down at her coffee and was quiet, and Stephen sat there and let her be quiet because he understood that there are things that need space. After a while she looked up and said, "Thank you for coming all this way. I told him I would. People say a lot of things." "I know," Stephen said. "But I told him I would, so I did." She looked at him for a moment with those careful eyes, as if she was measuring the distance between what a man said and what he was, and then she said, "Are you passing through Caldwell or staying?" He had not thought much beyond getting here. He had thought about Caldwell and Maggie Hale and the message he was carrying for so long that the idea of what came after had remained shapeless and far away. He looked at his coffee cup. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. She nodded slowly. "Well, if you're looking for work, the livery stable at the end of the street is run by a man named Earl Gaines. He's always looking for someone who can handle horses, and you look like you can." "What makes you say that?" "The way you were with your horse when you rode in," she said simply. "I was watching from the window." So he went to see Earl Gaines at the livery stable, and Earl Gaines, who was a short and deeply practical man with arms like fence posts and a face like a relief map of a difficult country, looked at Stephen for about 4 seconds and said he could start in the morning. That was how Stephen Brooks came to stay in Caldwell, Kansas, at least for a while. He found a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Carver, who charged $1.50 a week and included breakfast and supper, and who had the useful trait of not asking personal questions. He settled into the rhythms of the livery stable, which suited him, because working with horses was one of those things that did not require a man to perform a version of himself he did not feel like performing. Horses asked only that you be honest and consistent, and Stephen could manage both of those. He did not go back to the dry goods store for 5 days. He told himself this was because he had delivered the message and his debt was paid, and there was no particular reason to go back. This was true and also a lie, and he knew it was a lie because he found himself thinking about Maggie Hale at odd intervals throughout the day, in the particular way that a person thinks about something they are trying not to think about. On the sixth day, he needed flour and coffee and a new saddle blanket, and the dry goods store was the only place in Caldwell to get all three, so he went. She was at the counter again, but this time the store was empty, and when he came in she looked up with what might have been, very briefly, something other than perfect composure. "Mr. Brooks," she said. "Stephen," he said, "if you don't mind." "Stephen, then." She got down from the stool she had been sitting on and said, "What do you need?" He told her, and she moved around the store with the efficiency of someone who has spent years knowing where everything is, and he followed her, which was not strictly necessary but which he found himself doing anyway. "How is Earl treating you?" she asked, reaching up to the top shelf for the coffee. "Fair enough. He's not much for conversation." "No," she agreed. "He talks to the horses, though. I've heard him at it." "So have I," Stephen said. "I don't hold that against him." She glanced at him sideways, and there was the beginning of a smile there, and he noted it the way a man notes a landmark in unfamiliar country, something to navigate by. She brought everything to the counter and wrote out the price on a slip of paper, and he paid it, and when he turned to go she said, "The minister's wife organizes a Sunday meal for the town every week. It's at the church hall. You should come." He looked back at her. "Are you inviting me?" "I'm telling you it exists," she said, and there was that almost smile again. "What you do with the information is your business." He went to the Sunday meal. It was exactly what he had expected, which was to say a long table in a drafty hall with approximately 30 residents of Caldwell and the minister's wife, whose name was Mrs. Pryor, and who was the kind of person who managed the logistics of community with the quiet efficiency of a field general. There was roast chicken and corn bread, and a pie that someone had made with the last of the summer apples. Maggie was there, sitting between a woman named Clara who ran the millinery shop and an elderly man who Stephen learned was the town's former doctor, now retired. She had changed out of her work clothes into a dress of dark blue cotton, and she had done something different with her hair, though he could not have said precisely what, only that it made her look different, softer perhaps, or more like herself. It was difficult to know which. He sat across the table and 2 seats down, which was not close enough to be obvious and not far enough to miss what she was saying, and he listened to her talk about the wheat harvest and the price of dry goods, and whether the new family that had arrived from Missouri last week would find Caldwell to their liking. And he thought that she was the kind of person who paid attention to the world around her in a way that was genuinely generous, that she cared about these people and the little details of their lives. After the meal, when people were moving around and talking in the loose, sociable way that follows a good supper, Maggie found her way across the room to where he was standing near the window. "You came," she said. "You told me it existed," he said. She looked out the window at the street, where the late afternoon light was turning everything golden and hazy. "Thomas used to hate these things," she said, and her voice was easy and reflective, not heavy. "He would come because I asked him to, and he would sit there all evening looking like a man waiting out a thunderstorm, and then on the way home he would always say it wasn't so bad. Every time." Stephen smiled. "That sounds like him." She looked at him then. "You knew him well. 2 years on the trail, you know people. What was he like? Out there, I mean. He wrote, but Thomas never put much of himself on paper." So Stephen told her about Thomas on the trail, about his stubbornness over campfire coffee and his uncanny ability to predict weather changes and his habit of singing very badly when he thought no one was listening. And Maggie laughed at the singing part. A real laugh that she seemed slightly surprised by herself, and Stephen thought it was the best sound he had heard in a long time. They walked back to the store together in the long golden evening, not because he had offered and she had accepted, but because they had both simply started walking in the same direction, and it was only when they reached the door of the store that either of them acknowledged it. "Thank you," she said at the door. "For what?" "For telling me about him, the real parts." She looked at the door for a moment, her hand on the latch. "People around here are careful with me about Thomas. They mean well. But sometimes careful feels a lot like lonely." He did not know what to say to that, so he said, "Good night, Maggie." and she said, "Good night, Stephen," and went inside. He stood on the street for a moment before he walked back to the boarding house, and the evening was warm and full of the smell of dust and sunflowers. And somewhere down the street, a piano was playing something bright and slightly off-key in the saloon, and Stephen Brooks, for the first time in a very long time, was not thinking about the road ahead. September settled over Caldwell with a particular beauty that Stephen had not expected. The way the Kansas plains rolled out in every direction under a sky that was impossibly large and impossibly blue. The way the light came in low and golden in the late afternoon and made everything look like it had been painted by someone who felt strongly about it. He had spent most of his adult life moving from one place to another and had developed the traveler's habit of not noticing where he was, but Caldwell was making him notice. Part of this, he admitted to himself, was Maggie. They fell into a pattern without discussing it, the way that patterns establish themselves between two people who are paying attention to each other without admitting to it. He went to the store 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes for things he actually needed, and sometimes for things he found reasons to need. She began to have his coffee ready when he came in the mornings, which was a fact that she did not comment on, and neither did he. On Saturday afternoon, she closed the store early and she had taken to sitting on the bench outside with a book in her lap and a glass of lemonade, and often enough Stephen found himself walking past it around that time, which was not an accident but which both of them maintained the fiction of pretending was. "What are you reading?" he asked, the third Saturday in September. She held it up. It was a novel, one he did not know. "Is it good?" "It has a very dramatic moment in the second half that I'm still thinking about," she said. "Sit down if you want." He sat down on the far end of the bench with his hat in his hands, and they stayed there for a while in the pleasant September afternoon, Maggie with her book and Stephen watching the street. And it was comfortable in the way that only becomes possible between two people who have already been honest with each other about something real. A boy of about 12 ran past chasing a dog, and the dog tore around the corner of the millinery shop and the boy followed it, and Maggie watched them go with that quiet warmth she had for everyone around her. "Do you have children?" Stephen asked, before he had entirely thought through the asking. She looked at him, not surprised, just measuring. "No," she said, "we didn't. Thomas was away so often." And then she paused, and then time ran out. "I'm sorry. Are you?" She said it without sharpness, genuinely curious. "Yes," he said, "because you would have been good at it." She looked at him for a moment with those steady eyes, and then she looked back at her book. "You know," she said carefully, "you keep saying things like that." "Like what?" "Things that are true but that I'm not sure you should know yet." He turned his hat around in his hands. "I've been paying attention." "I know you have," she said quietly, and she did not look up from her book, but he could see the shape of something changing in the line of her shoulders, something settling. They were quiet for a while. The September afternoon moved around them, warm and unhurried. "What about you?" she asked finally. "Was there ever anyone?" "No," he said. "I never stayed anywhere long enough." "Why did you stay here?" It was the first time either of them had said it directly, and he found he had no pretense left for it. "You know why," he said. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, without looking up, "I think maybe I do." October came in with a wind that stripped the last of the summer from the plains and left the sky a clean, cold blue and the mornings sharp with the promise of winter. Stephen had been in Caldwell for 6 weeks, and in those 6 weeks the careful distance he and Maggie had maintained between themselves had been shrinking, not dramatically but steadily, the way ice thaws, which is to say invisibly, and then all at once. There were small things. The way she remembered that he preferred his coffee black and strong. The way he noticed when she was tired from a hard day and did not try to make her talk. The evening she had been struggling with a shipment that had arrived wrong, and he had spent 2 hours helping her sort through it and write the letter of complaint. And they had laughed so much over the absurdity of the invoice that she had cried a little at the end, which she claimed was from the laughing and which he did not argue. There were larger things, too. The afternoon he had found 2 men from out of town who were making trouble on the street near her store, nothing violent yet but moving in that direction. And he had dealt with them with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew exactly how much force a situation required. And she had watched from the doorway, and when they were gone she had said, "You've done that before." And he had said, "A time or two," and she had said, "Thank you." And the way she said it made it mean more than the two words. And there was the night in mid-October when there was a storm. A real plain storm with lightning that turned the whole sky white and thunder that shook the boards of the buildings. And Stephen had been at the store helping her move supplies away from a leak in the back room roof. And when the storm got very bad very suddenly, and the streets were running with water and lightning was cracking close enough to make the hairs on his arms stand up, she had said, without pretense, "You should stay until it passes." And he had. They had sat at that little table in the back room with the lamp between them while the storm raged outside, and he had told her about the winter in Colorado, the real version, not the one he had told Thomas's family out of kindness, but the one in which he and Thomas had been genuinely afraid they would not make it, and had talked about what they would regret. And she had told him about coming to Caldwell as a new bride at 20 years old, 6 years ago, about building the store from nothing with Thomas, who was so good with people but so bad with numbers, and she was the opposite, and how it had worked because they were opposite, and how she had thought they would have 50 years to keep working that way. "What did you tell Thomas you would regret?" she asked, her voice quiet under the sound of the rain. "Staying still," he said. "I told him I had never once in my life stayed still long enough to let anything real happen to me." He looked at the lamp. "He told me I was an idiot," she smiled. "He was right. He usually was." He looked at her across the lamp. "I told him I would think about it." "And have you?" "I'm still here in October," he said. "In a town I came to for one reason and found a different reason to stay." She looked at him, the lamp making her eyes bright, and the storm was enormous outside and the little room was small and warm, and he said, very quietly, "Maggie." And she said, "I know," which was the most complicated and complete answer she could have given him. He reached across the table and she put her hand out to meet him halfway, and he held it just that. And they sat together while the storm finished what it had to say, and then passed on east toward Missouri and left the night clean and cold and full of stars. He walked back to the boarding house in the wet cold with her hand still feeling warm in his palm, and Mrs. Carver, who missed nothing, looked at him when he came in and said, "Good Lord, man, you're smiling at 2 in the morning." Stephen did not have an answer for that except that it was entirely true. The thing that complicated everything was a man named Cole Radnor. Cole Radnor was one of those men who existed in the border country between rancher and something harder to name, who had interests in Caldwell that were not exactly legitimate and not exactly criminal, and that everyone in town had long since decided it was safer not to look at too closely. He owned a cattle operation west of town, and he had money, and he had developed, sometime in the past year, the habit of dropping by Hale and Sons with the particular manner of a man who considers himself to be doing you a favor by his presence. He was not violent, not exactly. But he was the kind of man who let you know that violence existed as an option somewhere in the background, the way a storm exists on a clear day if you know how to read the horizon. Stephen had noticed him the first week, and had watched him carefully since then, and had come to understand that Cole Radnor had decided that Maggie Hale's situation, a widow alone with a business that sometimes struggled, was a situation that he could use to his advantage in one way or another. He saw it directly for the first time on a Tuesday morning in late October. He had come to the store for what had become genuinely legitimate reasons. He actually needed a new strap for a harness that Earl had tasked him with repairing, and he was in the side aisle when Cole Radnor came through the front door. Radnor was a broad man, mid-30s, with the ruddy good looks of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors and knew it showed. He came up to the counter with his hat still on, which told Stephen something, and he leaned on it with both arms in a way that narrowed the space between himself and Maggie. "Maggie," he said, "I wanted to follow up on what we discussed." I don't think there's much to follow up on, Cole, she said, and her voice was perfectly level. My answer hasn't changed. Your answer doesn't make sense is the thing. He kept his voice easy, almost friendly. I'm offering you a fair price for the store, more than fair. You'd have enough to go somewhere comfortable, back east maybe, somewhere easier than this. I don't want somewhere easier, Maggie said. I want my store. You're making it harder than it needs to be. I believe that's my right, she said. Radnor's jaw tightened just slightly, and then he noticed Stephen coming around the end of the aisle with the harness strap in his hand, and his eyes went from Stephen to Maggie and back again, and something recalibrated in his expression. You're the man working at Earl's, Radnor said. That's right, Stephen said. You two know each other. Stephen has been a friend to this store since he arrived in September, Maggie said, and the word friend was delivered with a composure that was itself a kind of statement. Radnor looked at Stephen for another moment, measuring, and then he straightened up from the counter and put his hat more firmly on his head. Well, he said. Leave you to it. Maggie, you know where to find me when you change your mind. I'll remember that, she said. When Radnor was gone, the store settled back into its ordinary quiet, and Maggie let out a breath she had been holding and turned to put something straight on the shelf behind her. How long has he been doing that? Stephen asked. Since the spring, she said, without turning around. He made the first offer in March. He's been coming by every few weeks since. He wants the land more than the store. She turned then. Yes. The store sits on a corner lot that would be useful to someone who was looking to expand in a certain direction, which Cole Radnor is. She said it matter-of-factly, as if she had worked it through and arrived at the practical truth of it. Have you talked to the sheriff? Sheriff Dooley is a reasonable man, but Cole Radnor hasn't technically done anything. He's made offers. He's been persistent. She paused. He's uncomfortable. That's different from illegal. It is, Stephen agreed. But he looked at the door where Radnor had gone out and felt the particular settling in his chest that came before he decided that something was his business. He talked to Earl about it that afternoon, because Earl had been in Caldwell for 12 years and knew where the weight in town fell. Radnor's been after that corner lot for a while, Earl said, not stopping what he was doing, which was shoeing a horse with the concentrated competence of a man in complete harmony with his work. He's not going to do anything in the open. He's smarter than that. But there's a shipment Maggie gets every month from the supply company in Wichita. Comes through on the stage. Twice this year it's come in damaged or short. Stephen looked at him. I'm not saying, Earl said. I'm just saying. Stephen nodded slowly. If her supply lines were unreliable enough long enough, she'd have trouble keeping the store going. She's managed so far because she's sharp and careful and she plans ahead, Earl said. But there's only so much planning you can do. He thought about this while he worked through the afternoon, and he thought about it through supper at the boarding house, and he thought about it lying awake in his room while Mrs. Carver's clock counted off the hours. The debt was paid. He had come to Caldwell and delivered Thomas's message, and that was what he had owed. What he felt now was not debt. What he felt now was something different, and it was his entirely. He went to see Sheriff Dooley the next morning. Dooley was a lean man of about 50 with a gray mustache and the tired competence of someone who had been managing a border cattle town for long enough to have seen most things. He listened to Stephen without interrupting, which was the mark of a man who knew how to hear what was being said. I've had my eye on the shipping situation, Dooley said, when Stephen finished. But I need something specific. If you've got reason to believe the next shipment gets interfered with, I'd like to know in advance. I'll find out what I can, Stephen said. He did not find out through any dramatic means. He found out the way things are usually found out, which is by listening carefully in a place where men talked freely. The saloon on a Thursday night was that place, and Cole Radnor was not there, but two of his ranch hands were, and they were the kind of men who felt the need to feel important to each other. And over the course of an evening, Stephen learned, without asking directly for any of it, that the next supply stage from Wichita was coming through on Saturday morning, and that certain arrangements had been made. He told Dooley on Friday. On Saturday morning, when the stage came through, Dooley and his deputy were waiting at the edge of town where the arrangements had been made, and two of Radnor's men were persuaded to return to Radnor's ranch by the direct intervention of the law, and Maggie's supply shipment arrived complete and undamaged. When she found out, because Dooley told her directly and gave Stephen no credit for it, though Dooley knew and Stephen knew that the credit was there, she came to find Stephen at the livery stable that afternoon. He was brushing down a bay mare and he heard her step in the doorway, and when he looked up she was standing in the light from outside with her hands clasped in front of her and a look on her face that was complicated. "Dooley told me what happened," she said. "He kept brushing. Dooley handled it. Stephen." He stopped and looked at her directly. "You would have figured it out eventually. You're sharp and careful and you plan ahead." She walked toward him and he stayed still, and she came right up close, closer than she had been except for that night in the storm when she had put her hand in his, and she said quietly, "Why do you keep doing that?" "Doing what?" "Showing up. Helping." "Dang." "Because I want to," he said. "Because this place matters to me. Because you matter to me and I think you know that." She was very close now, and the barn was warm and smelled of horse and hay, and outside the Kansas afternoon was going gold in that particular way it had in late October, and she looked at him with those dark eyes for a long moment, and then she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, the same gesture a person might use to check whether something was real. "Stephen," she said. "I'm here," he said. She kissed him or he kissed her. It was the kind of thing that has no single author. It was careful at first and then not careful at all, and the bay mare turned to look at them with the mild curiosity of horses, and neither of them noticed. When they stepped back from each other, Maggie was breathing a little fast and she was looking at him with something open in her expression that he had not seen there before, something that had been kept very carefully protected until now. "I didn't plan for this," she said. "No," he agreed. "I don't entirely know what to do with it." "Neither do I," he said honestly, "but I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him for a long moment, and then something in her face resolved itself, the way a long equation comes finally to its answer. "Good," she said. The business with Cole Radnor did not resolve itself quite so neatly. Radnor was the kind of man who did not like being outmaneuvered, and having his plans interrupted twice, once by Dooley's intervention with the shipment, and once by the very visible and public fact that Maggie Hale was no longer alone in Caldwell in the ways that had made her a convenient target, did not improve his disposition. He stopped coming to the store, which was a relief, but there was something in the air of the town in November that felt like the period before a storm, that particular stillness. It broke on a cold Wednesday in the second week of November, which was 2 weeks after the kiss in the stable, and things between Stephen and Maggie had moved in the way that two people move when they have finally stopped pretending they are not moving toward each other, which is to say quickly, and with a kind of relief that felt to Stephen like putting down something he had been carrying a very long time. He was walking back from Earl's toward the boarding house in the early evening when Cole Radnor stepped out from the side street with two of his men. It was not ambush exactly. It was the more menacing thing of a man who wants to have a conversation on his terms. "I want to talk to you," Radnor said. "I'm listening," Stephen said. He had stopped. He was relaxed in the particular way that experienced men are relaxed in situations that require full attention. "You've been interfering in things that don't concern you," Radnor said. "I've been minding the business of a person I care about. That's not interference. That's just caring." Radnor's eyes went flat. "The widow Hale is a business opportunity that was in process before you showed up. I'd suggest you consider that." "She's not a business opportunity," Stephen said, keeping his voice even. "And she's made her position clear to you more than once. I'd suggest you consider that." They looked at each other in the cold November street, and Radnor's men were there, but they were also reading the situation with the careful attention of men who knew how these things could go. Stephen was not threatening anything. He was simply standing there with the absolute composure of someone who had already decided what he would and would not do. It was Radnor who moved first, not toward him but sideways, a small concession, a readjustment. You do well to think about how long you plan to stay in Caldwell, Radnor said. I plan to stay a long time, Stephen said simply. I like it here. Radnor looked at him for another moment, and then he nodded once, and it was the nod of a man who is recalculating, and he and his men walked back the way they had come. Stephen stood in the cold street for a moment and then went on toward the boarding house, and he thought that Cole Radnor was not finished, but that the shape of what he was willing to do had changed, because men like Radnor operated best when their targets were uncertain of themselves, and Maggie Hale was no longer uncertain, and she was no longer alone. He told Maggie about the conversation the next morning. She listened with her hands flat on the counter and a look that was not fear but was its alert cousin, and then she said, I've been thinking. About what? I've been talking to some of the other store owners on the street. I'm not the only one Radnor has made offers to. The millinery and the hardware store both had similar conversations this past year. She paused. If we all made a formal complaint together to Dooley, put it in writing, it would be harder to ignore than one person. Stephen looked at her. You already started organizing this. I talked to Clara at the millinery yesterday, she said, and to Frank at the hardware this morning. He felt the smile coming and let it. You are something, Maggie Hale. She looked at him steadily. I told you, I can keep things going. The formal complaint, signed by 4 businesses and delivered to Sheriff Dooley the following Friday, was not by itself enough to end Cole Radnor's ambitions, but it was enough to make those ambitions publicly known in a way that changed the community's relationship to them. Caldwell was a cattle town in 1882, and it had its rough edges, but it was also a place where people had built lives they intended to protect, and the social weight of the town was not something even Cole Radnor could ignore indefinitely. Dooley, with the written record and a wire to the county seat, began building something that would take several months to fully resolve, but the key thing was that Radnor understood he was being built against, and he scaled back. The pressure on Maggie's store stopped. His men did not appear near the supply stage again. The corner lot remained hers. It was not a dramatic resolution, but it was a real one, and in Stephen's experience, real resolutions were usually not dramatic. They were usually the product of careful people deciding to act together. November settled into a cold, clean quiet, and Stephen and Maggie settled into something that was becoming more than either of them had named out loud, though the outline of it was clear enough that the town of Caldwell, which noticed everything, had collectively decided to be pleased about it. Clara at the millinery smiled knowingly every time Stephen walked past. Earl Gaines said nothing at all but had begun giving Stephen slightly better work assignments, which was his form of approval. Mrs. Carver, who had told him in September that she did not allow courting in her establishment, and then watched him walk back from the store late one evening with Maggie's shawl over his arm to return it, said only that he was welcome to use the parlor on Sunday afternoons, which she had never said to any of her boarders before. They walked in the evenings when the weather allowed, and it was cold, but the sky was enormous and full of stars that were different from the stars everywhere else Stephen had ever been, or perhaps he had just never looked at them this way before. They talked about everything, about Thomas and about the trail and about what Stephen had been before and about what Maggie had wanted to be before life had made its own decisions, about the store and the town and the winter that was coming. One evening in late November, walking back from the far end of the main street where the lights from the saloon made yellow shapes on the dirt road, she said, "What do you want, Stephen? I mean, actually want." He looked at the stars. "This," he said. "Exactly this." She looked at him sideways. "You're not going to tell me you want to stay because you feel like you owe me something." It was an important question, and she was asking it directly, which was exactly her way, and he owed her the same directness back. "I came here because I owed something," he said. "I stayed because I chose to. Those are different things, and I need you to know the difference." She was quiet for a moment, walking beside him. "I think I do know," she said. "I just needed to hear you say it." "The debt was paid the day I walked into your store," he said. "Everything since then has been mine. The choice, the staying, all of it, Mine. She stopped walking and he stopped with her, and she looked at him in the cold, starry November night, and then she said, "I love you, Stephen Brooks." She said it the way she said things, straight and clear and with no decoration, and it landed on him like the most honest thing anyone had ever said in his direction. "I love you, Maggie," he said. "I think I have been for quite a while." She smiled then, a real open smile that he had seen building in pieces over months and had now arrived in its complete form, and it was worth every mile and every month and every cold trail night that had brought him here. They stood on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, on a cold November night under the enormous western sky, and the stars were out in their full extravagance, and a piano was playing something bright and off-key in the saloon down the street, the same piano, he thought, that had been playing the night he arrived. And for the first time in his adult life, Stephen Brooks was not thinking about the road ahead but about the ground beneath his feet, which was solid and real and exactly where he wanted to be. December in Caldwell was cold in the way that only the plains can be cold, a flat and persistent cold that came in with the north wind and stayed. The store was warm inside and busy with people stocking up for the winter, and Stephen helped Maggie in the afternoons when Earl did not need him, learning the inventory and the pricing and the careful economy of running a business in a town where you could not afford to get your calculations wrong. He was good at the numbers, it turned out, which surprised him and pleased Maggie, who said that Thomas had been a disaster at them, and she had always thought she would have to be one person's two halves forever. "I'm not trying to be what Thomas was," he said, one afternoon in early December when they were going over the month's accounts at the back table. "I know," she said. "You're something else entirely, that's the point." He looked at her. "Something better or something different?" "Something mine," she said simply, and went back to the ledger. He asked her to marry him on Christmas Day. It was not planned exactly in the way a person plans a thing, though he had been thinking about it since November in the way a person thinks about a thing they already know is true and are just waiting to say. They had spent Christmas Eve with Clara and her husband and the minister's family at the church hall, and on Christmas morning they had gone to the church service, and afterward they had walked back to the store together because it was cold, and it was where they went now when neither of them said anything particular about where they were going. She put coffee on, and he stood near the window looking out at the empty Christmas street, at the thin snow that had come in overnight and was still coming down in small, patient flakes, covering the boot tracks in the road and settling on the edge of the water trough and on the sign above the door of the livery stable. He turned around and she was at the stove with her back to him, and he said, "Maggie," she turned. He said, "I know this town, I know this store and what it takes to keep it. I know your mind and how it works, and I know you are better at most things than I am, and I'm not bothered by that. I know that you love Thomas, and that is a part of you, and it doesn't compete with what I feel, it just is. I want to be here. I want to be here for a long time. I want to be the person you're building things with." He paused. "I would like very much for you to marry me." She looked at him for a long moment across the small, warm room. "Yes," she said. And then she said, "Yes," again, as if once was not quite enough to hold everything it meant. He crossed the room and she met him in the middle of it, and he held her and she held him, and outside the snow came down on Christmas morning in Caldwell, Kansas, in 1882, and covered everything new and clean and white. They were married in February of 1883. It was a small wedding by the standards of some places, but large by the standards of Caldwell, because Caldwell was a community, and it had been watching these two people find each other for 6 months, and it felt entitled to celebrate the conclusion. The church was filled with people, with Clara and her husband in the front row and Earl Gaines standing in the back with his arms crossed, and what might have been, on a less weathered face, a smile, and Mrs. Carver in a hat she only brought out for important occasions. Maggie wore a dress of dark cream that Clara had helped her make, and she walked down the aisle of the church with the steady, deliberate grace that was entirely her own. And when she reached Stephen at the front of the church and took his hands, He looked at her and she looked at him, and the minister said the words that people have been saying for a very long time about what it means to choose someone. When it was over and they stepped out of the church into the cold February afternoon, the town cheered in the undignified way that people cheer when they are genuinely pleased, and Stephen stood on the church steps with Maggie beside him and looked out at all of it. The small, dusty town he had ridden into in August with nothing but a message and an old debt, and he felt something settle in him that had been moving for his entire adult life. They had a supper at the church hall with more food than anyone could account for and music from a fiddle player named Jonas who was slightly drunk but very good, and Clara's husband gave a toast that made Maggie laugh, and Earl Gaines drank 2 glasses of whiskey and told Stephen he was a lucky man, which was the longest personal statement Earl had ever made to him. Mrs. Carver cried and denied doing so. The spring of 1883 was a good one, wet enough to satisfy the wheat farmers and warm enough to make the plains bloom in the particular extravagant way they bloomed when the season was on their side. The business of Hale and Sons was good, and they talked in the evenings about expanding the store, about adding a section for tools that Frank at the hardware did not carry, about whether there was a way to handle freighting for some of the smaller farms in the area. They also talked about the name. "I want to change the sign," Maggie said one evening in April. "To what?" She looked at him. "Brooks and Hale, I was thinking, or Hale and Brooks." She paused. "Or just Hale and Brooks General Goods." He looked at the ceiling for a moment. "How about we keep Hale in it?" he said. "Hale is the name this store was built on and this town knows it. You don't mind?" "I married you," he said. "Not the sign," she smiled. "Hale and Brooks then, alphabetically makes sense." The sign was repainted in May, bright letters over the door, Hale and Brooks General Goods, and the town of Caldwell took approximately no time at all to start calling it simply Maggie and Stevens, which was the most honest name for it anyway. The business with Cole Radnor concluded itself over the spring and summer in the methodical way that legal things conclude themselves. Dooley's formal complaint, combined with a document that arrived from the county seat in March, established that Radnor's activities concerning supply interference were indeed criminal. He was assessed a significant fine, and his ability to operate freely in Caldwell's commercial sphere was curtailed by the kind of quiet legal weight that does not make dramatic moments, but that is effective. He sold his ranch operation in July and moved north toward Wichita, and the corner lot that held Hale and Brooks General Goods remained what it had always been, which was Maggie's. On the morning that she heard he had gone, Maggie stood in the store and looked out the window at the street for a long moment, and then she turned to Stephen and said, "It's a good corner." "It's the best corner," he said. She laughed. The summer was long and hot and golden and full, and they worked hard and came home in the evenings tired in the good way that meaningful work makes you tired, and they sat on the bench outside in the warm evenings and watched the town go by and talked about what they were building. Stephen had put up a new shelf system in the back room and was learning the business the way he had always learned things, by doing it and paying attention, and Maggie had taught him the supply ordering system and the account management, and he had shown her a more efficient way to log the inventory that saved her an hour a week. They had different strengths in the same direction, which was the best possible arrangement for 2 people who were going to spend their lives building something together. In July, the heat settled over the plains in that heavy prairie way, shimmering and total, and Stephen came in from a long afternoon moving freight to find Maggie sitting at the back table with a look on her face that was careful and contained and slightly different from her usual expression. He stopped. "What is it?" She looked up at him, and there was something in her eyes that was wondering and a little bit afraid in the way that good things are afraid, because good things carry responsibility. "I believe," she said carefully, "that we're going to need to think about a crib." He stood very still for a moment, and then he crossed the room and crouched beside her chair so they were at the same level, and he took her hands. "A crib," he said. "By January, I think," she said. I'm not entirely certain yet, but mostly certain." He looked at her for a long moment, and he did not say anything, but what was in his face was large and real and completely his, and she looked at him, and some of the careful composure she was holding gave way just slightly. "Are you happy?" she asked, in a voice that was smaller than her usual voice. "Maggie," he said, "I'm the happiest I have ever been in my life." She let out the breath she had been holding, and he put his forehead against her hands, and they stayed like that in the warm July back room of Hale and Brooks General Goods, which was the center of what they were building, and it was enough. She told Clara first, because Clara was her closest friend and had been since those early months after Thomas died, and Clara cried and said something entirely appropriate about how the universe sometimes gets things right. Then she told Mrs. Carver, who was technically no longer their landlord since they lived above the store now, but who was firmly in the category of family that is not blood. Mrs. Carver said that she had known in December and had been waiting patiently. Stephen told Earl, who looked at him for a moment and then said, without any expression, "Well, you'd better be sure the store roof is solid before the cold comes," which was Earl's way of saying that he was very pleased. The autumn of 1883 was beautiful and busy. Maggie grew and the store grew, and they hired a young man named Daniel Cook, who was 17 and very eager and slightly clumsy, but who learned fast, and who became in a short time genuinely useful, which meant Maggie could sit down occasionally in the afternoons without feeling that the whole operation would collapse. Stephen expanded his role from the livery stable to nearly full-time at the store, because there was enough work now for both of them, and Earl Gaines had, in his wordless way, communicated that he was not offended. Earl had found a younger hand to replace Stephen and had told him, with no ceremony, that he had done good work and ought to go be useful somewhere that needed him more. They did make sure the roof was solid. They did it in September, Stephen and a carpenter from the other end of town, working 3 days on the new boards while Daniel Cook ran the store and Maggie supervised from below and offered opinions that were generally correct. The winter came in early that year, a hard frost in November that coated the morning windows and made the main street of Caldwell creak with cold, and they were ready for it, with wood stacked against the back of the store and the supply orders placed and the inventory full, and the small rooms above the store warm with the cast iron stove that Stephen had installed in October, and that Maggie had said was the best purchase either of them had ever made. Their son was born on the 19th of January in 1884. He came into the world on a cold, clear night with the plains lying still under the winter stars, and Maggie was brave and strong in the way that she was brave and strong about everything, which was to say that she did what needed to be done without pretense, and Clara was there, and the doctor who had come back out of retirement for the occasion because he said he was not going to miss this, and Stephen was there, which was not the custom but which Maggie had made clear was going to happen, and which the doctor had accepted because you did not argue with Maggie Hale about things she had decided. When the baby was there and Maggie was holding him and the room had settled back into something like peace, Stephen sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at this person they had made together, this small and perfect and entirely new person who was already looking at the world with the dark, serious gaze of someone who intended to pay attention to it. "He has your eyes," Maggie said. "He has your nose," Stephen said. "What are we going to call him?" They had talked about names but had not landed on one, the way that some decisions are best made when the person they belong to has arrived. Stephen looked at his son. "Thomas," he said, and looked at Maggie. She looked at him for a moment, and what moved across her face was love, layered and complicated and entirely resolved, the past and the present and the future of it all in one look. "Thomas Stephen Brooks," she said. "Thomas Stephen Brooks," he agreed. She looked back at the baby, at Thomas Stephen Brooks, who was looking at the ceiling with the deep concentration of new humans, and she said, very quietly, "Thomas would have liked you very much." Stephen was not entirely sure whether she was talking to the baby or to him, and thought perhaps she was talking to both, and thought also that this was the kind of moment that does not require precision. The spring of 1884 came in gold and green and vigorous, and Thomas Stephen Brooks grew and thrived in the way of healthy winter babies who have survived their first cold season and entered the world's warmth with full intention. And the store was busy, and the planes were blooming. And Stephen Brooks stood one morning in front of Hale and Brooks General Goods in the April sunshine and looked up at the sign. He had been in Caldwell for a year and 8 months. He had come in August of 1882 on a borrowed horse with a dead man's message in his chest, and nothing particular ahead of him. And he was standing now in front of a store that was his and a life that was his and a woman inside who was making the morning coffee, and who would hand him his cup exactly the way he liked it when he came through the door. And there was a baby in the crib upstairs who would want his breakfast in about 20 minutes and whose early morning voice, which was not quite language yet, but which was clearly going to be opinionated language very soon, could already be heard through the open window. He thought about Thomas Hale, who had died in a Colorado meadow with the sun on his face and this woman's name on his lips, and who had asked Stephen to carry a message because he trusted him, and Stephen had carried it not because the debt obligated him but because Thomas had been his friend, and because it was right. He had not known, carrying that message, what it would give him. He could not have imagined it. He thought sometimes that Thomas had known, in the way that people sometimes know things at the end that they cannot explain. The message he had sent was not about the store, not really. It was about Maggie, about who she was and what she could do and what she deserved, and maybe Thomas had understood something about the man who was going to deliver it, about what that man might do if he only stopped moving long enough to let something real happen to him. He would never know, but he thought about it. He went inside and Maggie handed him his coffee without looking up from the ledger she was reviewing at the counter, and he stood next to her and looked at the numbers over her shoulder, and she said, without looking up, "The order from Wichita is due Friday. Daniel is going to meet the stage." "Good," he said. "Also the Hendersons want to open an account. Do we trust them?" "I trust her," Maggie said. "I'll think about him." Stephen drank his coffee, and from upstairs came the rising and insistent sound of Thomas Stephen Brooks beginning to make his morning demands on the world, and Maggie put down her pencil and looked at the ceiling with the exasperated and completely helpless love of a new mother and said, "I'll go." "I'll go," Stephen said. "Finish the ledger." She looked at him. "Stephen, I know where everything is," he said. "I helped build the crib." She smiled at him, that complete open smile, the one that had taken months to earn and that he had not once in the time since taken for granted. He went up the back stairs and through the door into the small, warm living space above the store, where Thomas Stephen Brooks was standing up in his crib, all 9 months of him, holding the rail and shouting about the injustice of breakfast not yet having arrived, and Stephen lifted him out and held him against his shoulder, and the shouting stopped immediately because there is something deeply satisfying to a baby about being held. And Thomas made a series of small, contented sounds and grabbed a fistful of Stephen's collar and held on. Stephen stood at the window that looked out over the back alley where the sunflower still grew, returning every spring with the same unreasonable determination, and held his son. And outside the April morning was bright and warm, and the plains stretched away in every direction under a sky that had no ceiling. By the summer of 1884, Hale and Brooks General Goods had become a fixed and certain institution on the main street of Caldwell, the kind of place that anchors a community, where people came not only for flour and coffee and fabric, but for the sense that the people inside it knew them and cared about the small facts of their lives. Maggie was the kind of storekeeper who remembered what a family had bought last month and what they had mentioned needing, and Stephen was the kind of man who could carry a conversation about cattle prices, or weather patterns, or the state of the northern trails, with the easy knowledge of someone who had lived most of his life outdoors. And together, They made the store the kind of place that people were glad to be in. They expanded in the autumn, as they had planned, adding the tools section and a small area for seeds, with an eye toward the farming families who were spreading out across the Kansas plains in the years after the railroad had made it possible. The railroad had come through Caldwell in 1880, 2 years before Stephen arrived, and its presence had changed the town in ways that were still working themselves through, bringing new families and new commerce and the particular energy of a place that has decided it is going to be something. Daniel Cook, their young hire, had grown into genuine competence and had brought on his younger sister, a girl of 19 named Nell, who was steady and quick with figures, and who had the additional quality of being able to talk to customers in the particular warm way that made them feel seen. The store was no longer just Stephen and Maggie. It had become something larger. On a warm evening in August of 1884, nearly 2 years after Stephen had ridden into Caldwell on a borrowed horse, he and Maggie sat on the bench outside the store in the last of the summer light, and Thomas was on Maggie's lap examining a stick, with the total absorption of a 10-month-old encountering the idea that objects have texture and weight. And the street of Caldwell was busy in the way that late summer evenings are busy. People moving between the businesses and the saloon and each other in that loose, sociable, end-of-day way. "I was thinking," Maggie said. "What about? Thomas is going to need someone to fight with," she said. "In a few years." He looked at her. She was looking at Thomas and his stick with a small, composed smile. "Are you telling me something?" he said. "I'm thinking about the possibility," she said. "In the general sense." "The general sense," he repeated. "March, I think," she said. He felt the same stillness he had felt the first time and the same opening of something large and warm in his chest. He put his arm around her on the bench and she leaned against him, still watching Thomas and his extremely interesting stick, and the summer evening moved around them and the piano was playing in the saloon, and the lamp in the store window was warm and gold against the coming dark. "We'll need a bigger crib," he said. "We'll need a bigger room," she said. "We can do that," he said. "I know we can," she said. He thought about the first day he had walked into this store, about the woman behind the counter who had looked at him with careful eyes and said, "Can I help you?" in the voice of someone who was used to managing things alone. He thought about Thomas Hale in that Colorado meadow and the message, and the road he had ridden down every day for 14 months telling himself he was paying a debt. He thought about all the things the word debt meant, and all the things it did not mean, and how those two categories were entirely separate, and how knowing the difference between them was the most important thing he had ever worked out. He had one debt left to pay in this world, and she was the one he owed it to, and he had paid it, and discovered that what was on the other side of paying it was not the end of anything but the beginning of everything. Thomas dropped his stick and made a noise of outrage, and Maggie picked it back up and handed it to him, and he grabbed it with both hands and returned to his study. And Stephen watched his wife with his son in the last of the summer evening, and thought that this was the thing. This was the thing that all the years of moving had been pointing toward without his knowing it, the way a river moves toward the sea without understanding the sea, only knowing that something is drawing it forward. He pulled her a little closer, and she settled against him, easy and comfortable, and they sat together in the August evening on the bench outside the store that bore both their names, and the stars began to come out over Caldwell, Kansas, the enormous, unreasonable western stars, and everything was quiet and complete. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was gentler than the previous one, which felt like a mercy. Thomas Stephen Brooks was walking by December, unsteadily and with great determination and the occasional spectacular fall, and the store was warm and busy with holiday trade, and Maggie was comfortable and steady through the cold months, and by February the whole town of Caldwell knew what March was going to bring because Maggie Hale had never been the kind of person who made her business secret, and the town had decided to be pleased about it again. Their second child arrived on the 18th of March, 1885, A boy again, which seemed to confirm a pattern, and they named him James Hale Brooks, taking Maggie's name into the middle as a way of carrying it forward. And James was from his first hours a different creature entirely from his older brother, louder and more immediately opinionated and fascinated by his own hands in a way that Thomas had not been. And Stephen held him in the early hours of the morning, while the March wind swept over the plains, and said to him quietly that the world was a fine place and he had arrived at a good address. Thomas, who was 14 months old and deeply interested in this new development, spent the following days pointing at James and saying something that was not quite a word yet, but was clearly a strong opinion. And Maggie watched her two sons regard each other across the small world of their living space, and felt something so full inside her that she had to look away sometimes to keep herself from crying, which she considered an embarrassing response to happiness, but which she had decided to permit herself. Stephen caught her at it once, looking away from the two boys with bright eyes, and he came and stood beside her and put his hand against the small of her back. "You all right?" he said. "More than all right," she said. "Don't tell anyone." "Tell anyone what?" "That I'm this happy," she said. "I have a reputation as a practical woman," he smiled. "Your secret is safe with me." Spring of 1885 opened the plains up again in that annual extravagance of green and gold, and Hale and Brooks General Goods was in its third year, solid and proven, and the two people running it had found between them a partnership that worked the way the best partnerships do, which is to say that neither could have been what they were without the other, and both of them knew it and were glad. Sheriff Dooley retired that spring, and his replacement was a younger man named Carter who was well regarded, and the town of Caldwell was settling into a kind of prosperous maturity, the wildness of the early cattle town years softening without being entirely lost, which was the right balance for a place that wanted to keep its character while building something permanent. Stephen thought sometimes about the injustice of how things worked in the West, how the land had been taken from people who had lived on it for generations, how the law protected some interests and not others, how men like Cole Radnor existed because systems allowed them to, and he thought that building something honest in the middle of all of it was not nothing, that keeping a square account and treating people fairly regardless of where they came from and building the kind of place that anchored a community was a form of resistance to all the ways things went wrong. It was not everything, but it was what he could do from where he stood, and he did it. Maggie thought about these things too, and talked about them on the evenings when they sat together, and she had made it a point from the first days of the store to extend credit to homesteading families, who others would not have trusted, and to keep her prices honest in seasons when scarcity might have let her raise them. And the town remembered these things and returned them with loyalty and trust. On a warm evening in June of 1885, nearly 3 years after Stephen had first ridden into Caldwell, he and Maggie stood side by side on the main street watching the annual summer social, which was a tradition that the town of Caldwell had instituted the previous year, and which involved a dance in the church hall and food and the full participation of everyone. And Thomas, who was now a sturdy and energetic 2-year-old, was being chased around the churchyard by Daniel Cook with the somewhat desperate energy of someone who has been put in charge of a small person and has discovered that small people are very fast, and James, at 3 months, was asleep in Maggie's arms with the profound peace of someone who had not yet learned that the world was complicated. The music from inside the hall was bright and alive, the fiddle going fast over something that had too many steps for Stephen to follow, but that several pairs on the floor were managing magnificently. And the evening was warm and golden in that June way, long light and sweet air, and the smell of the plains in full summer. Stephen looked at his wife and his 2 sons and the town that had become his town, and he thought about a borrowed horse and a message and a debt, and he thought about the distance between what a man owes and what a man chooses, and how the best things in life happen in that distance, in the space where obligation ends and love begins. "Dance with me," Maggie said. "I'm a terrible dancer," he said. "I know," she said. "I've seen you." She shifted James to her other arm and held out her free hand. "Come and be terrible with me." He took her hand. They went into the church hall together, into the light and the music and the community of people who had watched them find each other and who were glad. And they danced badly and entirely without shame. And Thomas caught up to them from the churchyard with Daniel Cook trailing behind him breathing hard. And someone took James so Maggie could use both hands. And the fiddle played on, and the summer evening was long and full, and the stars were waiting beyond the bright windows for later. When the music was done, and Caldwell was quiet. Later, much later, walking back to the store in the warm summer dark with Thomas asleep against Stephen's shoulder and Maggie beside him carrying James and the summer constellations out in full above them, the Milky Way unrolled across the sky like something extravagant and free. Maggie said, "I've been thinking about Thomas's message." He looked at her. "What about it?" "What he said about keeping things going." She was quiet for a moment. "I used to think that was about the store. And now I think he meant more than that," she said. "I think he meant keep yourself going, keep choosing, keep building." Stephen thought about this as they walked, about Thomas Hale who had been his friend and who had known something, and about the woman beside him who had kept everything going, the store and herself, and now this family and this life, with the particular stubbornness of someone who believes that showing up is itself a form of faith. "He was right," Stephen said. "He usually was," Maggie said, and her voice was fond and clear without grief in it, only the settled warmth of something fully made peace with. They reached the store and Stephen got the door with his free hand, and they went inside together, into the dark quiet of the closed store with its smell of wood and coffee and everything they had built, and they went upstairs and put their sons to bed, Thomas without waking and James with brief protest, and then surrender. And they stood together in the doorway of the room where their boys slept and looked at them in the faint light from the window. Then they went to bed themselves, and the summer night moved over Caldwell, Kansas, warm and enormous and full of the particular silence of the plains, which is not really silence at all but a sound so large it feels like it. And Hale and Brooks General Goods stood on its corner with the sign still readable in the moonlight. And the world was quiet. And Stephen Brooks, who had come to this place to pay a debt and stayed because he had found a reason larger than any debt, lay in the dark beside the woman he loved and listened to the sound of his sleeping children and the sound of the town at rest and the sound of the plains in summer. And he was, without reservation, exactly where he was supposed to be. This was what the West had given him, not the years of movement and dust and open sky, though those too had shaped him, but this corner, this store, this woman, these children, this belonging. The debt was paid, and what had replaced it was something that would last his whole life and shape the lives of his children and their children after them. And it had started on a road in August when he had ridden toward a town he did not know to find a woman he had never met and tell her something her husband had asked him to say. He had one debt left to pay in this world, and she was the one he owed it to, and paying it had been the best thing he ever did.